The discovery by Copernicus that the Earth rotated round the Sun radically altered humankind's perception of the universe. Other astronomers supported him. Galileo found himself arraigned before the Inquisition for such heresy. He later recanted, but the seeds of doubt had been sown. Some philosophers, too, began to reject the established geocentric doctrine. In Italy, Giordano Bruno fell foul of the Inquisition for publishing his dialogues on cause, principles, and unity. Unlike Galileo, he refused to recant. He was burnt at the stake in 1600. But science and religious philosophy were drawing closer together. No arts, no letters, no society. And which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In 1640, Thomas Hobbes had fled to France. There, for a time, he became tutor to the future Charles II. Hobbes' ideal ruler was, like the Stuarts, an absolute monarch, whose function was to keep the peace and preserve order. 2 years later, King Charles I and his parliament went to war. This conflict was to shape Hobbes's political thinking, and in 1651, he penned his greatest work, Leviathan.
The experience of the English Civil War, and also the study of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which Hobbes translated, shaped Hobbes' thinking about politics to the extent that it brought home to him in a way that few political thinkers really have it in the forefront of their minds, that the stakes in political thinking and political practice are very high. And if things go politically very wrong, then the consequences are like extreme misery for virtually everybody.
There were other influences. Hobbes' idea of a social contract between the ruler and the citizen owes much to Machiavelli, Richard Hooker, and Hugo Grotius. Hobbes followed Grotius' idea that there was a natural law which was based on man's nature as a social animal. Hobbes was also fascinated by why men go to war and what inclines them to peace. Every man has the right to use his own power. Liberty is the absence of obstacles to achieving this. But in times of emergency, the citizen should relinquish his rights to the ruler in the national interest. So political obligation rests upon a moral obligation. Hobbes later added a further obligation upon all citizens, a simple obedience in all things wherein their obedience is not repugnant to the laws of God. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Most people are familiar with Descartes' famous dictum. He arrived at this by a policy of doubting things in general. His discourse on method set out 4 rules that all pursuit of knowledge should follow. I am. I exist is necessarily true whenever I utter it or conceive it in my mind. But Descartes arrives at his conclusions by a process of rigorous self-examination. His system depends upon what is evident to the individual. An idea is whatever is in our mind when we conceive a thing. Pierre Gassendi raised many objections to Descartes' meditations.
Gassendi's objections, the fifth objections, really are an extraordinary document. They're, in a way, they're the most interesting objections precisely because they are the objections of a philosopher who was coming from a point that was entirely different from Descartes'.
It would be wrong to think of Descartes as a genuine skeptic. He was the first of the rationalists and claimed he employed hyperbolic doubt.
Hyperbolic means something like beyond any ordinary reason for doubt. It is beyond any ordinary reason for doubt, precisely because it's calling into doubt what's morally certain, and what's morally certain, by definition, is beyond all reasonable doubt. It's an unreasonable doubt.
For Descartes, to perceive, to seem to see or hear something, is really to think. Since we know clearly and distinctly about external objects through intuition and the intellect, then the intellect can know itself even more clearly and distinctly. Descartes uses the example of a piece of wax. The intellect perceives it as having certain physical properties. When the wax melts, these properties disappear. Yet it is still wax, even though it is now, as he says, something extended, flexible, and movable. Extension is the key factor.
The case of the mutability of the wax, that famous passage toward the end of the second meditation, one of the things that illustrates for Descartes is that what we call the secondary or sensory properties of physical objects are, on his view, fundamentally confused properties. They're not properties that can be fully grasped by the intellect. And so if we were empiricists and believed that our knowledge of external objects comes entirely through their sensory properties, for Descartes that would be like a counsel of despair, because it would amount to admitting that we can't actually have a proper intellectual grasp of objects in the world around us. But rather than advocate such a counsel, Descartes, by focusing on extension as being of the essence of physical objects, gives an account of our knowledge of physical objects that conforms to his conception of what the intellect does, because the properties associated with extension, as James said, are susceptible of a geometrical and more generally mathematical analysis. And these are properties which, on Descartes' view, and in a way that's also amenable to common sense, are sort of proper objects of the understanding, in a way that sensory properties like colours and smells and tastes and so forth are not.
In Meditations, Descartes gives two proofs for the existence of God. In Descartes' view, we must show that God is the cause of the idea we have of him. This idea is not something we have made up ourselves.
Descartes presents in the Meditations three arguments for the existence of God. Some people think there are only two. I think there are three. Two of them are what are called cosmological arguments based on conceptions of causation in the third meditation. And in those arguments, Descartes claims that only God is a sufficiently powerful being to have caused the idea of God in our minds. And also the second argument is that only God is sufficiently powerful to have caused the existence of our minds, given that our minds contain the idea of God. These arguments are based on somewhat obscure scholastic terminology, in particular the distinction between formal and objective reality. And for these and other reasons, they're not really taken seriously as candidates for establishing the existence of God by philosophers these days. The story with his third argument for the existence of God, the ontological argument in the fifth meditation, is rather different, because in that argument he argues that God must exist on the basis of the nature of the concept of God alone. That is, it's part of the real nature of God that he must have all perfections, and existence is a perfection, and he must therefore exist, just as it's part of the nature of a triangle to have interior angles adding up to two right angles.
For Descartes, the existence of God was linked to the knowledge of science. Extension is the essential nature of matter. Knowledge of it comes from geometry. This gives us knowledge of the objective properties of things. All science depends upon the knowledge alone of the true God. By the sixth meditation, Descartes still didn't believe he had proved that material things exist. He knew they could exist, insofar as they were considered as objects of geometrical proof. Also, our imagination persuades us that material things exist. God can produce anything we can conceive, exactly as we conceive it. Descartes then moved on to try and answer the question, what am I? It is certain that I am entirely and truly distinct from my body, and can exist apart from it.
The point really about saying that mind and body are really distinct is that it follows that God could keep the mind, that is to say the rational soul, the soul, in existence after the body dies, and consequently the possibility of the immortality of the soul is actually demonstrated by showing that mind and body are really distinct. It's not that it's shown that the soul is immortal, but it's at least shown that it's possible that the soul is immortal. We can make sense of that possibility. That's what's important to him about the real distinction between mind and body. An interesting point to note there is that the faculties of sense perception and imagination are tied in a way to the body. Although they are modes of thinking and hence belong to the mind, they belong only to embodied minds. And if we then try to even conceive of what it would be like, so to speak, to be the rational soul after the death of the body, well, it's no longer going to have sense perception and imagination. All it's got is the pure intellect. And in a sense, all it's got to think about is objects of the pure intellect, which, roughly speaking, correspond to geometry, arithmetic, metaphysics, logic, and God. So it's going to be the existence of the soul after the body dies is going to be a very different existence from its existence now. But as I say, the point of saying that mind and body are really distinct is to make the point that the soul can survive the death of the body.
Descartes did not think that everything was a function of his own mind, but his approach tends to be in that direction. His views were to influence such people as Isaac Newton, but he had his critics. Another prominent critic was Blaise Pascal, remembered for his famous wager. God is, or he is not. But to which side shall we incline? Let us weigh the gains and loss in wagering what God is. Let us estimate the two chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager, then, without hesitation, that he is. I have striven not to laugh at human actions, not to weep at them, nor to hate them, but to understand them. Spinoza was a Dutch Jew. His parents had fled the Inquisition in Portugal and settled in Amsterdam, where Spinoza was born in 1632. He was brought up as an Orthodox Jew, but soon grew skeptical. He was excommunicated for his beliefs and left Amsterdam in 1660. He took a keen interest in science, corresponding regularly with members of the Royal Society in London. Strangely, it is the lapsed Jew Spinoza, rather than the devout Catholic Descartes, whose writing contains the more religious element. Like Aristotle and Plato, Spinoza was concerned with how human beings can attain the good.
Well, the good for Spinoza, or the state which he describes as that of human blessedness, is something to be achieved through knowledge of ourselves, knowledge of the world, and knowledge of our relationship to the world. Spinoza thinks that knowledge is something that comes in different degrees or levels. So at the lowest kind of level, there's the knowledge we gain in everyday experience from the things we read, from the people we talk to. And this kind of knowledge, although Spinoza admits it's very useful, he thinks that nonetheless it's pretty unreliable. However, he thinks it's possible, through the use of our human reason, to free ourselves from its errors and illusions and to arise to a higher kind of knowledge, the kind of knowledge that you find, for instance, in philosophy and science. But moreover, he thinks it's possible to continue this process of rational refinement and finally to arrive at a state of knowledge in which we have an immediate and intuitive vision of the connected whole that is the universe. And this state, which Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God, is, he thinks, the highest state possible for a human being. It's our supreme goal.
For Spinoza, the main function of God is to be the first cause, by which he means something like rationale. In truth, there can be conceived only one substance which is absolutely independent, and that is God. Except God, no substance can be granted or conceived. All things are in God, and God is the immanent cause of all things. God necessarily exists. Spinoza allows the existence of only one infinite substance, the cause of everything else. The human mind is simply part of the infinite intellect of God. Mind and body are essentially connected.
Well, Spinoza hoped to cut through all of the problems that had beset his predecessor, Descartes, concerning the relationship between the mind and the body, through the very simple but bold course of declaring them to be identical, the very same thing, not two, but one. They were, as you might say, two different ways of looking at the same thing. The way something appears from the outside, as it were, and the way in which it's like to be that thing. Although that said, it needs to be remembered that that's not quite right, because to talk of one reality which could be taken or could be understood in two different ways suggests that perhaps it isn't really either of them. And for Spinoza, reality is very definitely something which can be understood in both of these ways.
In the third part of ethics, Spinoza deals with the nature of emotions. Freedom comes from an understanding of oneself and one's emotions. The greater that understanding, the greater one's understanding of God. Freedom becomes the acceptance of absolute determinism. We are all modifications of God or nature. Spinoza died in 1677 of consumption. Most of his works were published posthumously. At first they were greeted with incomprehension. It was only later that his contribution to philosophy was fully appreciated.
Well, the poet Novalis describes Spinoza as God-intoxicated, and he's always appealed to those of a religious, spiritual, even mystical orientation. On the other hand, he's also been very popular with people who emphasize human reason and who are unhappy with the notion of the supernatural, because it's a very clear consequence of Spinoza's philosophy that nothing can ever interfere with the system from outside. There are no miracles. So perhaps Spinoza's greatest contribution to philosophy is to suggest a way in which these two seemingly opposing views of the world can somehow be reconciled together. Because if he is a mystical philosopher, he's nonetheless a thoroughly rational mystic.
There is nothing without a reason. Philosophy was in Leibniz's blood. His father was a moral philosopher in Leipzig. Much of his life was spent in the service of the House of Brunswick, and he was commissioned to write its history. Surprisingly, he published only one book of philosophy in his lifetime, the Theodicy, a work on natural theology. But he wrote many unpublished works, the most important of which was the Discourse on Metaphysics.
Apart from one book and a number of occasional articles, the vast bulk of Leibniz's material was unpublished during his lifetime. And it is vast. The catalogue contains some 57,000 items. Most of it consists in drafts and notes and sketches. He seems to be one of these kind of philosophers who thought things out on paper. But a great deal of it consists in correspondence, and much of what he wrote was prepared for the many individual scholars that he entered into correspondence with. This isn't perhaps so unusual in its time, but of course the loss to modern scholarship is that there is no one place that we can go to for any kind of full or systematic account of his views.
Leibniz wanted to produce a universal, logical and mathematical language. This would have made possible the solution of a whole range of problems.
The problems that would have been solved if such a goal was attainable are mostly to do with avoiding the sorts of errors that one runs into when one's language is ambiguous or where the meaning of words is not clear, is imprecise, and so on.
According to this plan, all knowledge would be fundamentally a matter of definition, and therefore it would be possible to settle any dispute by consultation to some kind of universal encyclopedia or dictionary. It needs to be remembered that this project belongs really to the earliest phase of Leibniz's career, and as his thought progressed, it was either abandoned or at least relegated to a back seat. But it remains important because the vision of knowledge as an interconnected whole, as well as a certain amount of the logical apparatus that was developed for the scheme, these things continued to influence his philosophy throughout his career.
Leibniz believed that the world consists of substances he called monads. He developed his theory in a work entitled Monadology. Although Leibniz was a rationalist, his theories also made allowance for the use of common sense. He agreed with Aristotle that substances were the basic things that made up the universe, but he believed that these substances must be absolutely simple. Leibniz believed that this world was just one of an infinite set of worlds God could have created. Leibniz describes these worlds as compossible, meaning that their components must fit together. The world God chooses to create is the best compossible one. God had so created the world that everything that was true of a substance was necessarily true of it, because it followed from its individual essence. Leibniz also believed in the principle that he called the principle of sufficient reason.
The principle of sufficient reason says that for every truth there must be a reason why it's so and not otherwise. Or, what Leibniz takes to be equivalent, that everything has a cause. What it rules out is the possibility that certain things might just happen or be for no reason whatsoever. Now, we may not know what that reason or cause is, says Leibniz, but nonetheless we can be assured that there must be one. The principle of sufficient reason is a very controversial principle that has and indeed continues to divide philosophers.
Antoine Arnauld attacked Leibniz's theory. If God had programmed Adam to fall, there was no room for freedom. Leibniz argued that freedom, causal determinism and logical determinism were all different. After 40 years of faithful service with the House of Brunswick, Leibniz fell out of favour with his master, England's future King George I. He died in Hanover in 1716. John Locke was the son of a West Country lawyer who had supported Parliament during the Civil War. Locke was part of a movement that came to be called British empiricism. He entered the service of the first Earl of Shaftesbury. In 1683, when his master seemed in danger of being impeached for treason, Locke went with him to the Netherlands. Locke spent 6 years there. Once William of Orange had replaced James II on the English throne, he felt it safe to return. It was during his self-imposed exile that Locke wrote his Essay Concerning Human Understanding. Locke tries to define what he means by the term idea. That term which, I think, serves to stand for whatsoever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks. In Book 1 of the essay, Locke attacks the view that there are innate principles such as identity and contradiction and principles of morals. Many people believed in such principles because they believed they were universally assented to. Locke denies this. He believed only that there might be innate capacities. In Book 2, Locke has a simple answer to the question, where do ideas come from? In one word, from experience. Experience does this in two ways, through sensation and through reflection.
We form ideas from sensation and reflection by a combination of noticing the resemblance among the ideas we get from our senses and by abstracting and recombining ideas to form more complex ones. So it's possible to form the idea of an animal that you've never seen, like a unicorn, by putting together ideas that are directly derived from things you have seen, like that of horses and horns.
Locke also distinguishes between simple and complex ideas. He takes it for granted that his reader will know what a simple idea is. Later philosophers, such as Wittgenstein, showed that there were no such things as simple ideas in the sense that Locke taught. Yet it was a concept at the very centre of empiricism itself. Locke classified complex ideas in terms of their objects, substances, modes, and relations.
Substances for Locke are basically things that exist in the world, material objects, and he thought that the best guess as to what the ultimate substance was that it was extended stuff, matter, but atoms, made up of atoms. Modes are just what we would now call properties. They're ways in which substances can be. And relations are other involving properties, such as being to the left of or being heavier than.
When he published his fourth edition of the essay in 1700, Locke offered a different basis for classifying ideas. Locke made an important distinction between primary and secondary qualities when dealing with the simple ideas of sense.
Locke famously made a distinction between primary and secondary qualities, but he wasn't the first to make this distinction. It's made by Galileo, and it's also made by the ancient Greek atomists. And the idea is roughly to distinguish between the properties of things which they really have and the properties which they only appear to have. So, for example, imagine 3 bowls of water, one of which is cold, one of which is lukewarm, and one of which is hot. If you put your hand in the hot bowl and then the lukewarm one feels cold. If you put your hand in the cold one and then the lukewarm one feels hot. Hence, it's argued that the hotness of the water is not a property it has in reality, but merely a property that it has insofar as it appears to you.
It seems that Locke often failed to heed his own advice, as laid down in Book 4. Locke also wrote 2 treatises on civil government. The principles laid down in the second of these were to influence the drafting of the American Constitution. Man being by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. But everyone has the right to punish everyone for the evil he has done. Everyone has the executive power of the law of nature. Locke's view of the state of nature differs sharply from Hobbes. All men have an obligation to the other members of society. In Locke's ideal state, there is no absolute sovereign. Land and animals are common to all men, but become an individual's private property when he uses them. The purpose of his treaty on civil government was to defend the glorious revolution of 1688, and many of his ideas are not always practical. Yet his ideas can be said to have laid the foundations for Western democracy. Truth is the cry of all, but the game of the few. George Berkeley was born in Kilkenny and became Bishop of Cloyne. He is perhaps best remembered for his theory that material objects exist only as ideas in the mind. To be is to be perceived. Dr. Johnson famously ridiculed this by kicking a stone. I refute it thus. Berkeley's theories are based around immediate perception, that we first perceive the proper objects of the senses, such as light, sound, smell, and taste. He assumes that these sensations are ideas. This idea is similar to that of Aristotle. As Berkeley made clear, not all ideas are sensations, but all sensations are ideas. He often uses the terms interchangeably. Locke had asserted that the secondary qualities of an object were subjective. For instance, when we are near a fire, we may feel pain. Is it the idea of warmth produced by the fire, although the pain is in us? This fails to distinguish between warmth and feelings of warmth. Berkeley accepted Locke's argument, but said that similar considerations applied to primary qualities as well. Berkeley's first work, Theory of Vision, is a work on optics. He also included in it extracts from Descartes' dioptrics. Berkeley believed that the retina of the eye was a two-dimensional surface. It was impossible for the third dimension to be projected onto it. A man named Molyneux had once raised the question, if a man born blind were to gain his sight, would he immediately perceive things as at a distance? Berkeley's answer was no. He said the man would need experience to connect the ideas of sight with the ideas of touch. Berkeley saw himself as a man of common sense. He seems to have been unruffled by the ridicule of men such as Swift and Johnson. He held God to be the author of nature, whose existence is evident in the ideas he produces.
Berkeley's conception of God places him quite squarely in the tradition of Descartes and Malebranche, in the sense that, well, and ultimately Plato, in the sense that for Berkeley, God is the supreme ground of being and of intelligibility and of perceptibility. So Berkeley thinks that the role of God is to really sustain everything in existence. And because Berkeley thinks that to be is to be perceived, he believes that to sustain things, well, to be is to be perceived or to perceive. So where ideas are concerned, i.e. entities whose being consists in their being perceived, if God is sustaining them in existence, he's doing so by ensuring that they are continuously perceptible. And that's why for Berkeley, objects in the external world, and he does think there is such a thing as an external world, he just thinks it's composed of ideas rather than material substances. Objects in the external world do continue to exist even when we're not perceiving them, but only by courtesy of their being continuously perceived by God.
David Hume was born into a family of poor landed gentry in Edinburgh in 1711. One of Hume's major concerns was the relationship between cause and effect, causality. It was, and still is, important not only to Hume, but to philosophy generally, because without an understanding of it, the universe consists of random, unconnected events. Understanding causality not only means making sense of the world we live in, but our place in it as well, and our experiences. Hume started with attempts to prove the existence of God and the self. Hume claimed we must have observational evidence and experience of God and the self. But we have no direct experience of God. We cannot hear, see, touch, or experience God in any tangible way. Feeling that God must somehow exist is not enough.
Hume is a skeptic as far as religion is concerned, because the mind operates through custom, and there is this kind of cement through habit and association. It can only work on material that has been received through the senses. Because there is no impression of God or of anything beyond this world, we can't appropriately extend the abstract ideas that we think we have but are just these bundles to the realm of the religious. So there's an attack on religion which is very strong, and really one of the things that he argues is that all priests are necessarily hypocrites because they have to disguise to themselves their unbelief, and he doesn't go as far as to deny that God exists, but through the mouth of various characters he undermines belief in a first cause, in God as a substance, in the soul as a unity, and in immortality of the soul.
Hume concludes that in order for us to have any knowledge of a supreme being is to witness an action that transgresses the laws of nature, as it is only through the world that God, as an infinite being, can express his nature and make himself felt. So God makes his presence known through miracles. Hume claimed that, like God and the self, we cannot observe causal connection.
For Hume, causality is just a succession of ideas, a contiguity of ideas, which are then linked together by the mind. And you can't actually find the necessity in nature. It's something that the mind adds in on top.
This holds true even with things that seem certain, like night following day. Day is not the cause of night. Night is brought on by the rotation of the Earth on its axis as it travels around the sun. We cannot observe this rotation, so how can we be completely sure that night will follow day? Can we get beyond conjunction of events to actually observing their causes? Can we distinguish between events that are causally connected to those that are not? If we cannot, how can we make any general statements about the world? Where does this leave science?
He's not attacking science. As I said, he thinks of himself as a Newton of the mind. It's just that science and the connections in science have to be explained psychologically instead of in terms of logical and philosophical relations.
Hume had an answer to this seemingly bleak scenario. Although he advises we should hold our opinions with a healthy dose of skepticism, Hume was realistic about what drives human beings and the role played by the emotions. If we did try to live our lives querying everything we saw and stubbornly refusing to go about our daily lives because we do not know anything for certain, we would all curl up and die. It is better to be proved wrong sometimes in our assumptions than to abstain from doing anything at all. So act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or that of any other. In every case as an end with all, never as means only. Immanuel Kant is the giant of 18th century philosophy. Many would argue he was the greatest philosopher ever. In 1781, he published his Critique of Pure Reason. He followed this with two further critiques, on practical reason and judgment. He also wrote on religion, politics, and psychology. Though all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it all arises out of experience. Kant did not even accept the empiricist's theory that all ideas arose out of experience.
Well, he agreed with the empiricists in that he thought that all our knowledge, all our substantive knowledge about the world must ultimately relate to experience, which is a basic empiricist theme. And he was sure that they were right about that. He was as reluctant as they were to countenance the idea of conclusions about things that utterly transcended our experience. For example, he had no patience at all with attempts to prove the existence of a transcendent God, or with speculations about an afterlife, for example, what might happen to us after our deaths. When these were understood as attempts to come again at substantive knowledge, I mean, he didn't feel that we could have knowledge about these things at all. He was sympathetic to attempts to think in those terms and to speculate about those things, but he was of a mind with the empiricists in denying that we could know anything about those realities beyond our experience. So in that sense, he was very much in line with them, as against the rationalists. He agreed that all our knowledge must ultimately relate to experience and be grounded in experience. But he didn't think that it was all simply read off from experience. He thought that when we derived knowledge of the world through the deliverances of experience, it was because we ourselves were appropriately receptive to what was out there. And being appropriately receptive meant having certain faculties in terms of which we interpreted what was out there, certain faculties that enabled us to make sense of what was out there. And an analogy that is often used in this connection, it's not Kant's own analogy, but it's quite a useful analogy, is that it's as if we were operating with a pair of spectacles, epistemological spectacles, through which we interpret what the world throws at us, as it were. But these spectacles are unlike ordinary spectacles in that we can never take them off. I mean, everything that we know through this basic framework. They provide a kind of structure for what we know, a framework, as I say, through which we interpret things. That is where the element of idealism lies, because we ourselves are making a contribution to the shape of our experiences. The reason why Kant wanted to call it transcendental idealism, saw it as a special kind of idealism, was that we could never take our spectacles off. There was no such thing as taking our specs off and stepping back and looking at this process as it was in itself. We were always constrained to see things through this basic framework. And that's why he felt that it was appropriate to distance himself, for example, from Berkeley, whose view was also obviously an idealist view, but who felt that the idealistic processes that were giving us knowledge were themselves things that we could reflect on and come to know about.
Kant later attempted to justify the various principles according to which objective experience must be organized. In the section of the Critique of Pure Reason called the Dialectic, Kant explores his own theory of ideas, which are pure concepts of reason. Because we have reason, we naturally have these ideas. Kant also dealt with ethics and morals. Nothing in the world, indeed nothing even beyond the world, can possibly be conceived which can be called good without qualification, except a good will.
What Kant means by a good will is a will that's exercised in complete accord with its own freedom. That's to say, a will that is, in a popular phrase that's often used in this connection, a will that's a law unto itself. It's following its own principles, its own rules, its own laws. And those laws, Kant believes, he has all sorts of interesting arguments to substantiate this belief, those laws are the laws of morality. A good will is a will that acts on principle, purely for the sake of principle, doing what it does simply because that's the right and proper thing to do, that's the law governed thing to do, and doing that in turn simply because it's acting in accord with its own laws. That is to say, it's acting in a way that's completely autonomous and free. So a good will is a will that's, if you like, obeying the laws of its own freedom. And that has important resonances for Kant, because that in turn is a will that is completely moral in its determinations, in its behaviour, in the behaviour that it causes.
In the Critique of Judgment, Kant explores how our aesthetic judgments depend upon the interplay of imagination and understanding. Kant lived for 80 years, but never married. During that time, he never strayed far from his native Königsberg, but his philosophy was to influence the whole world.
In modern philosophy, Kant's influence is second only to that of Descartes. So the defining moment of the beginning of modern philosophy is Descartes' Meditations. Then the defining moment of later modern philosophy is Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And Kant's influence is, in the 19th century, he spawns a whole idealistic, romantic movement in philosophy, unintentionally. In the 20th century, he's very influential in ethics, but also in political theory.
I mean, he's had an absolutely immense influence in general, and specifically on subsequent philosophers. His general influence has to do with the various Enlightenment ideals that he championed. He's a major figure in the Enlightenment, and we all know what kind of an influence that in turn had. He helped to put reason back on the map. He was able to champion reason and to give a compelling account of how much reason is able to achieve, how much human beings are able to achieve through the use of reason, through being purely rational, which is obviously a very important Enlightenment theme. And in particular, in his views about moral philosophy, he was able to give, again, a very compelling account of how far we're able to get in distinguishing between right and wrong simply by using our own natural, rational resources without having to appeal to authority, and in particular without having to appeal to the authority of religion. So that's a huge Enlightenment impact that he's had, but also specifically on philosophers. I mean, there's virtually no philosophy that has come since, in the 200 years since Kant died, that has not in some way been influenced by Kant. Very few people nowadays are straightforward Kantians. It's not that kind of influence. And people that see things in a very non-Kantian way still recognise the force of his arguments and the strength of his position and see it as something that they have to respond to. So he's pretty much shaped the whole nature of subsequent philosophical discussion, set the parameters, determined what it is that people feel that they have to discuss, what the main issues are, what the main questions are that need to be addressed.
As the 19th century dawned and the Industrial Revolution changed the nature of society forever, philosophical thinking would begin to take a new turn. Established beliefs would be challenged. And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In 1640, Thomas Hobbes had fled to France. There, for a time, he became tutor to the future Charles II. Hobbes' ideal ruler was, like the Stuarts, an absolute monarch, whose function was to keep the peace and preserve order. 2 years later, King Charles I and his parliament went to war. This conflict was to shape Hobbes' political thinking, and in 1651, he penned his greatest work, Leviathan.
The experience of the English Civil War, and also the study of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which Hobbes translated, shaped Hobbes' thinking about politics to the extent that it brought home to him in a way that few political thinkers really have it in the forefront of their minds, that the stakes in political thinking and political practice are very high. And if things go politically very wrong, then the consequences are like extreme misery for virtually everybody.
There were other influences. Hobbes' idea of a social contract between the ruler and the citizen owes much to Machiavelli, Richard Hooker, and Hugo Grotius. Hobbes followed Grotius' idea that there was a natural law which was based on man's nature as a social animal. Hobbes was also fascinated by why men go to war and what inclines them to peace. Every man has the right to use his own power. Liberty is the absence of obstacles to achieving this. But in times of emergency, the citizen should relinquish his rights to the ruler in the national interest.
With extension, as James said, are susceptible of a geometrical and more generally mathematical analysis. And these are properties which, on Descartes' view, and in a way that's also amenable to common sense, are sort of proper objects of the understanding, in a way that sensory properties like colours and smells and tastes and so forth are not.
In Meditations, Descartes gives two proofs for the existence of God. In Descartes' view, we must show that God is the cause of the idea we have of him. This idea is not something we have made up ourselves.
Descartes presents in the Meditations three arguments for the existence of God. Some people think there are only two. I think there are three. Two of them are what are called cosmological arguments based on conceptions of causation in the third meditation. And in those arguments, Descartes claims that only God is a sufficiently powerful being to have caused the idea of God in our minds. And also the second argument is that only God is sufficiently powerful to have caused the existence of our minds, given that our minds contain the idea of God. These arguments are based on somewhat obscure scholastic terminology, in particular the distinction between formal and objective reality. And for these and other reasons, they're not really taken seriously as candidates for establishing the existence of God by philosophers these days. The story with his third argument for the existence of God, the ontological argument in the fifth meditation, is rather different, because in that argument he argues that God must exist on the basis of the nature of the concept of God alone. That is, it's part of the real nature of
The discovery by Copernicus that the Earth rotated round the Sun radically altered humankind's perception of the universe. Other astronomers supported him. Galileo found himself arraigned before the Inquisition for such heresy. He later recanted, but the seeds of doubt had been sown. Some philosophers, too, began to reject the established geocentric doctrine. In Italy, Giordano Bruno fell foul of the Inquisition for publishing his dialogues on cause, principles, and unity. Unlike Galileo, he refused to recant. He was burnt at the stake in 1600. But science and religious philosophy were drawing closer together. No arts, no letters, no society. And which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. So political obligation rests upon a moral obligation. Hobbes later added a further obligation upon all citizens, a simple obedience in all things wherein their obedience is not repugnant to the laws of God. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Most people are familiar with Descartes' famous dictum. He arrived at this by a policy of doubting things in general. His discourse on method set out 4 rules that all pursuit of knowledge should follow. I am. I exist is necessarily true whenever I utter it or conceive it in my mind. But Descartes arrives at his conclusions by a process of rigorous self-examination. His system depends upon what is evident to the individual. An idea is whatever is in our mind when we conceive a thing. Pierre Gassendi raised many objections to Descartes' meditations.
Gassendi's objections, the 5th objections, really are an extraordinary document. They're, in a way, they're the most interesting objections precisely because they are the objections of a philosopher who was coming from a point that was entirely different from Descartes.
It would be wrong to think of Descartes as a genuine skeptic. He was the first of the rationalists and claimed he employed hyperbolic doubt.
Hyperbolic means something like beyond any ordinary reason for doubt. It is beyond any ordinary reason for doubt, precisely because it's calling into doubt what's morally certain, and what's morally certain, by definition, is beyond all reasonable doubt. It's an unreasonable doubt.
For Descartes, to perceive, to seem to see or hear something, is really to think. Since we know clearly and distinctly about external objects through intuition and the intellect, then the intellect can know itself even more clearly and distinctly. Descartes uses the example of a piece of wax. The intellect perceives it as having certain physical properties. When the wax melts, these properties disappear. Yet it is still wax, even though it is now, as he says, something extended, flexible, and movable. Extension is the key factor.
The case of the mutability of the wax, that famous passage toward the end of the 2nd meditation, one of the things that illustrates for Descartes is that what we call the secondary or sensory properties of physical objects are, on his view, fundamentally confused properties. They're not properties that can be fully grasped by the intellect. And so if we were empiricists and believed that our knowledge of external objects comes entirely through their sensory properties, for Descartes that would be like a counsel of despair, because it would amount to admitting that we can't actually have a proper intellectual grasp of objects in the world around us. But rather than advocate such a counsel, Descartes, by focusing on extension as being of the essence of physical objects, gives an account of our knowledge of physical objects that conforms to his conception of what the intellect does, because the properties associated